I'd like to introduce our final speaker, if that's okay. No, right, we'll just do it anyway. Sorry, thanks. So we have our final speaker, and after this we'll have a slightly foreshortened Q&A roundtable with all the panelists, with what I think is such a fascinating conference. So let me introduce Professor Hourya Bentouhami, who is a French-American associate professor of philosophy at the Université Toulouse-Jean Jaurès and a member of the Institut Universitaire de France. Her work on political philosophy and phenomenology focuses on the sensorial dynamics of racialization and gender assignment, and on forms of economic dispossession, as well as on the ways of disobeying them to create new forms of seeing and feeling in a livable world. So please join me in welcoming Professor Bentouhami.
Thank you very much. And first of all, thank you, Julia, for gathering us to this conference. I think it was really stimulating from the first conference and had the first lecture. So today I'd like to start with the following question. How do we maintain the productivity of the future, its generativity, not economically speaking, or in a capitalist term, but the historical productivity of the future? With what terms, what concepts, what language can we describe what is not yet? Precisely insofar as it must in some way never completely happen in order to maintain its utopian, which means its critical dimension. What social change can we think of against the structural injustice linked to the deprivation of temporality for existence? There are lives that are precisely considered out of time or squeezed by capitalist acceleration with the impossibility of inhabiting the future. That makes sense. World populations can be then deprived of the horizon in the phenomenological sense of the word. It seems to me that we need to reconnect with the language of lived life, of ordinary life, in our critical language, and to try to reconnect the Marxist project of the critique of oppression with the project of critical phenomenology, which aim to describe the structures of violence from its phenomenality, that is to say, from the effects of violence on corporeality, on flesh and the lived body, and not just violence against the living body. And conversely, of course, phenomenology needs to think in terms of structure or totality, and not just in terms of the singularity of an intersubjective encounter, but also in terms of the matrix logic that drives capitalism, governments of fear, particularly with regard to immigration, so as to undo the future by destroying the material, ecosystemic conditions of people's existence. For example, by depriving them of food or access to drinking water. For my part, the critical task will consist in posing this question of the future, of the possibility of its experience, above all within the framework of a language of care, and in particular, of the care of children. That is, from the generational point of view of those who are born into the world, who are really new. And this in the language of ordinary, daily reproduction of care, and therefore in the language of social movements for peace, reproductive justice, or migratory justice against police brutality. The question of children, of who really bears them, socially speaking, of who has a right to childhood, or on the contrary, of who has been stripped of the status of child, or even of who has been forced to be an eternal child, all these questions must be asked in relation to the materiality of the social relations that organize the temporality of our lives. To be a child, or to be perceived as such, etymologically speaking from the Latin, one who does not yet speak, so to be a child or to be perceived as such is to be in a situation of linguistic vulnerability, where one is exposed to being told, and therefore even more so, to being deprived of the possibility of having a future, which often equates to exposure to social death or even premature death altogether. So in everyday language, when you ask people what their vision of the future is, they often reply that they want to protect their children, for instance. It's almost a cliche that children are the future. So I'm not saying that from a normativist or prospective point of view, saying that we all have to have children if we want a future, which would be vulgar familialism. But I'm saying this because we need to take into account the de-virtualization of the future by capitalist, repressive police and racial policies, as what the Palestinian theorist Nadera Shalhoub-Kavokian calls unchilding. In her book, Incarcerated Children and the Politics of Unchilding, it was published in 2019, she shows how colonial violence against Palestinian children renders them mute. The premature experience of imprisonment at the hands of the Israeli administration also means that they are not children, but enemies. They lose their status as children, which is why they are considered violentable and killable. And this criminalization and racialization of Palestinian childhood is an attack on the lived world of children and on the proliferation of the language, where words do not have a quotational relationship with reality, which is the charm of childhood language, and in a sense its creative and inventive power. There's a childlike pleasure in the arbitrariness of language and its metamorphic possibilities, so much so that to repress children is to attack the future of language, of their imaginary, and of the very possibility of their lives. I'll come back to this question of unchilding. So is there a phenomenality of the future outside the way we dream it, stammer about it, or play with it? Thought, says Hannah Arendt, thought cannot be conceived outside language. Thought and speech discount each other. They continually substitute each other. Each counts literally on the existence of the other. So these opening words are those of Hannah Arendt in Life of the Mind, when she tries to determine what in thought is indissociable from the living and what is at the same time detached from these metabolic processes of reproduction of the same. For her, thought should be that which is beyond the living, reduced to the conservation, reproduction, and repetition of what has been. But what I'm trying to see, what in the language of the future stems from the conception of the living not as identical reproduction, but on the contrary, as bifurcation and predictability. In short, I would like to try to queer the future to make it foreign to itself. If I'm interested in the language of the future today, it's not just to talk about how we will speak in the future, but about a language that can grasp today what belongs not to a fixed body, not to a fixed place, to a time that is not yet, constantly projected into a future that by definition cannot be realized, at the risk of falling into the present and the past, and thus being struck by temporal imposture. My question then is this one. What is a language that rejects the future in its empirical, implacable coming as a repetition of the order of things? Is it possible to think of a life in the future without reducing it to the reproduction of the same? Can we therefore think of a future that is out of sync with the present and thus grasp it from within an asynchronous language, one that disengages in its enunciation from what is happening, from the regime of naturalization of facts? In short, a language that does not repeat what is, but opens up a horizon, a power to say no to a naturalized world order that is considered unjust. So the philosophical task of thinking about the future is not, for me, for political philosophy, to know what we will be able to do or achieve in the future, that is later, in the sense of planning deferred action, of seeing the condition for realizing future action. The critical, decolonial, and feminist task is, it seems to me, is to consider the future as a time par excellence of social critique. Indeed, it's more a question of asking what can the future do to save us from ongoing catastrophes. For it's all about thinking in the present about what's happening now, about current events, and to do this, we need to put the question, what can the future do that is as a possible, even though it has not yet happened, but above all in the sense that its utopia is constrained by oppressive forces, where the very dream of another world is ceaselessly considered impossible in the hell of humans' violence against humans. So here I'd like to show how there is a form of oppression that is not just historical, but temporal, in the sense that the deprivation of a horizon of expectation and the very amputation of the possibilities inherent in the experience of the future is part of oppression in the political sense of the term. That is, it is an alteration of the possibilities of making the world and living a livable life. In this way, I seek to understand how the coloniality of power proceeds through the colonization of the lived world, which operates on the basis of this atrophy of the possible, which is crushed and compressed into mere effectivity, to the point where the worst danger for thought and language of the future is precisely to say what will be, to predicate, to establish the course of events and of the possible in a chain of predictability that withdraws from the future its ideality, that is fundamentally its inactuality. So we must respond to this colonization of the future with a no future. So this expression, no future, is often taken as a form of nihilism in the postmodern era, which would be the exact opposite of soteriological discourses that would see the very path to salvation in the beyond of the time, the beyond of the future, that would be eternity outside of time. But to me, it seems that no future is to be understood as like no borders, for example, or as stop brutality, that is as a refusal of the future as the empirical power to govern time, as a biopower of lived time, that is to say, as a refusal of the impossibility of experiencing one's own temporality and existence. No future means refusing to dream in the given terms of capitalist oppression, imperialist war, and patriarchy. In fact, no future is a reflection on the future of the future. It's in this way that we can understand a refusal of the empirical future, like the implacable, it'll be like that and nothing else, a form of theological refusal to see our time reduced to that of an overexploitable or simply disposable, surplus, expendable value. Is a refusal to become a self-entrepreneur, for example, in our neoliberal area, the refusal to produce oneself as a being who has no time, who is always in a hurry, beyond time, ceaselessly tense, constituted by a project of managing one's life dedicated solely to preserving the lives of others, supposedly more worthy. I'm thinking in particular of reproductive work and the temporality involved in this work, always deferring the care of one's one life so that others can live with dignity or prosper. So I'll come back to this idea later that capitalism creates both beings who are always late, this is even one of the forms of temporal oppression, and beings who are, and produces also, impatient subjectivities made possible by the credit form of capitalism, in the sense that debt becomes our mode of existence, of enjoyment of the commodity. So when I speak of the colonization of lived time, and in particular of the impossibility of experiencing the future as possible, I'm thinking in particular of the way in which entire populations are constituted as incapable, culturally, religiously incompetent of producing the future, of generating their own sustainability in the sense of endurance in a competition for survival. So we find this idea in the biopolitics of race and gender, homophobia, which posits that their sexuality is incapable of the future, that their populations unfit for the future, hence eugenic practices, for example, which have been based on the idea that we must kill off the possibility of perpetuation, so macabre ideology supported by an imaginary of proliferation, of ungovernable multiplicity, of the invasion, what that will come, to replace us. This is based on a psychoanalytical schema of population replacement anxiety. So what state racism seeks to control is the very generativity of the future, and therefore the very idea of descending generations. There should be no more descendants, even from the imaginary point of view, no more heirs. It has often been said that racism and racial thinking proceed according to a scheme of filiation based on ethnicizing rewriting of ancestrality, stock origins. In other words, a mythologizing of ascendance. But we also need to see how rationalizing thought includes an imaginary of the future, an imaginary of selectivism and eliminativism graved onto a thought of the anguish of degeneration, of bad descent, and a more contemporary version of which is the idea of civilizational decline, found, of course, on the far right and in authoritarian ideologies. The idea then would be to reject and even eliminate those who cannot reproduce the ascendant dignity of the race. Hence, of course, in history, the forced sterilization of the mentally ill, of Jews, the condemnation of homosexuals, the so-called corrective rapes aimed at rectifying the race, and so on. So this violent control of reproductive bodies and births is indeed a way of killing the future, which is moreover properly genocidal. In every genocidal logic, there is a construction of the self as having no future if other populations constructed as intimate enemies remain. It can therefore be considered genocidal to kill the infants of racialized peoples on a systemic basis, as well as to permanently undermine a population's reproductive capacity. In this respect, feminicide is of course a way of removing the so-called monstrous feminine from the empirical future. But it is also a way of terrorizing women, and turning them into survivors, that is, beings whose very temporality is on hold. Similarly, so I come back to the process of unchilding, as the Palestinian theorist Nader Shalhoub-Kavakian puts it in her book, is also a way of rationalizing the future, in the sense that in the geopolitical economies of paranoid defense of territorial sovereignty, the children of others are seen as enemies and therefore as violent. So she places the children in the center of Israeli settler colonialism's interworkings. And unchilding in her work refers to the authorized eviction of children from childhood for political goals, and is maintained by a violent, racist, and classist machinery that exists in Israel. So she crafted this term in the context of the Zionist settler colonial project, which uses Palestinian children from conception, it's important, through death as tools to build the state of Israel. And she argues that to eliminate the next generation of Palestinians, so symbolically or materially speaking, Israel treats Palestinian children as both nobodies who are unworthy of children's rights, but also as killable, violentable bodies who needed to be caged, dismembered physically and mentally. So the overall purpose of our insightful book is to take us to demonstrate that politics cannot be separated from issues relating to childhood. And here, childhood is not just a psychological and developmental one, but a political issue directly targeted by the state through its technology of control, including through police and military technologies. So I just give an example of that. For instance, in France, in 2018, we had 19 teenagers, mostly male teenagers, who were handcuffed in their classroom and put against a wall by police force to punish for having participated in a demonstration against the school reform. And here we can use the Charles-Kervoukian analysis to see how there is a necessity for the state in its law enforcement strategy to unread racialized children as children. And I'm not going in all our argumentation, but she demonstrates really carefully how there is an industry of killability of the unwanted, the unregistered, the already dead, who are the kids. So she reactivates this idea of social death and provides numerous other examples to prove that systematic state crimes against children are, of course, nothing new, but something that can that come also from the first settlement of Israeli states. So childhood is not a given state for racialized children. And then consequently, future is all the less a given. On the contrary, the experience of the deprivation of future is the most common. So yet, relying on the language, the ledger, the conversation, and as devastating as unchilding is, Charles-Kervoukian shows that children have the power to interrupt the socio-political order through the word, through the language. At their own level, she shows how children understand or express something of the complex concepts of biopolitics, necropolitics, dispensable order, the non-human, the limits of the human, and so on. And then, of course, she advocates that it is, of course, up to the lawyers, to scholars, to put the children's words, their language, their description of reality and ordinary experience in rights claiming for protection from the state and its ordinary violence. So if racism has a mythical reconstruction of origins and filiation, there also has an imaginary biopolitic future without certain populations. So there is a myth of a pure future, in the sense of purified of the impurities of those who are constituted not only as non-human, but as inhuman and therefore anti-human, as threats to the ethnic racial group that has self-constituted itself as human and subject of law. And this idea of a pure future in racial supremacism, which we also saw to some extent in Make America Great Again, but also in Israel, in the idea of a land rid of the enemies of national greatness. Well, this idea of purified future, which is in reality a deadly dystopia, is inseparable from demographic thinking about the number we will be and the space and resources we have to live in. So, of course, what I understand by no future, so in an anti-fascist perspective, of course, it it is a refusal of a racial, homophobic and ecologically disastrous future of resource monopolization for the sole survival of a chosen people. So this racialized future is opposed by another vision of the future, which consists in opening up virtualities, in experimenting with the future in the almost logical sense of that which contradicts the de facto state of the present, the so-called order of things. So it posits that the way to make the world cannot consist in a mortifying logic of devitalization of earthly beings. The whole question then of resistance to forms of capitalist oppression, whether sexed or racial, is precisely this. How can we wrest the future from its empiricity and give it back its ideality, its futuricity, that is profoundly, structurally inactual generativity? How to rechild the future, how to find a common language between, on the one hand, reproductive justice, so the right to have or not have children, to raise them with dignity, to grant them a right to the future, and on the other hand, social justice, which means real access to the material conditions of existence for a dignified life. So the challenge is also to overcome the disjunction between experience on the one hand, which would always be experience of the actual, and the possible on the other, by showing that the possible is itself the object of experience, so that it can be the subject of phenomenological descriptions. So, as my colleague and friend Claudia Serban puts it, the most elementary phenomenological gesture could be the passage from the actual to the possible, where metaphysics has always been interested in the passage from the possible to the actual. End of the quote. So, in political phenomenology, then, it is a matter of escaping the metaphysical conception of the primacy of objectivity. And in feminist critical phenomenology, we are precisely trying to rethink we can that relies precisely on the passage from the effective to the possible, the state of the status quo of what it is to the possible. And more particularly for our children, we need to keep the possible always at the heart of their activities, because the only language that is authentically of the future is that of the possible constantly opened up by practice, that is to say, the virtual. So a language of the future must be able to think conceptually, critically about our children's exposure to the devirtualization of their existence. And like, for instance, we have to be careful, of course, to their exposure, the ordinary exposure to police violence. So such a critical theory, as Audre Lorde puts it, is precisely one that starts from the heart of the experience of those who make up the global soul. And you know, she has this in Sister Outsider. She has this section where she addresses an American feminist, a white feminist, and she says to her, "You're afraid that your sons will betray you and join the patriarchal order. We are afraid," she said, "that our sons will be ripped from a car and killed at point-blank range." So what do? We have, from this ordinary experience, we have another critical theory, of course, of what it is to defend ourselves. And here, obviously, I'm thinking also, for instance, in France, of the death of Nahel Merzouk last summer. It was a 17-year-old boy killed during a traffic stop by a policeman at the wheel of his car. So to believe in the possibility of the future is, in a sense, to verge on a kind of, I think, critical, theological, political, in the sense that we need to understand how to stand upright in time, to imagine ourselves as a people to come and never already here, who in fact will never be fulfilled and never have been. So what I seek to understand in the language of possible future is a form of non-coincidence with ourselves, a critical exercise that is more maybe ethical. So there is an irreducible, I think, theological political element in emancipatory thinking about the future, which is precisely the opposite of religious fundamentalism or identity-based conservatism. So I'd like to clarify this point. A fundamentalist, egalitarian understanding of the future, consists in saying that the future is past, that the very ideality of the future is past, that it has already happened, and that all that remains to us is to repeat it. This is a melancholization of the future, a way of looking at the future always from its loss. That is to say, from not being anymore, its being disappeared, from its vanished effectivity. So this nostalgia for the future, which is a paradox, is based on a dehistoricization of time, since it consists in saying that present time is expendable and that lives themselves can only survive in another time. Too bad for contemporaneity as it is. So the consequence is that the present and present-day living beings are thus violent now, since they can be saved later, since it's never too late, since the future can be realized even in the afterlife. And Fatima Mernissi, for instance, she's a Moroccan theorist, has clearly shown how Muslim religious fundamentalism has worked on this point, and the same could, of course, be said of all religious fundamentalism. So from then on an ethical level, thinking about the future of the future, and therefore saving the future from its empiricality in the future, is precisely to make concern about its actuality, a source of protection against all the monopolizers of the future, the preachers, the declared positivists of diachrony and the irreversibility of temporal phenomena. There is no alternative, for instance. But also the anachronistic fundamentalists. So let me explain. We must resist the temptations that would make any people an accomplished sovereign people. Already happened, immemorial. What allows us to speak of the future from its ideality, from the becoming that essentially inhabits it, is precisely to consider that I can say nothing definitive about it, and that is precisely always structurally to be. So I propose to disrupt the famous Augustine approach of time in Book 11 of the Confession. He posits a kind of drama of the soul of a distentio animi, which means that the answer to what time is a non-answer. Time is what I experience without being able to determine what it is, because reflection on temporal existence is made up of paradoxes and aporias. So I know how to live in the present, says Augustine. I know I've lived in the past. The future, on the other hand, is more characterized by nothingness. I can't live in the future. I can experience it, and the very modality by which I reflectively relate to it is precisely non-being. So, how do we speak? What language can express this double nothingness that is the future? And Augustine sees this as an existential tragedy, the very sign of human finitude. But it seems to me that this aporia of the future and the double nothingness that characterizes it is precisely its power, its positivity, if you like, in the sense that it is because the future escapes our saying that we can precisely imagine it, fabulate it. So every fabulation is in some way futuristic in the sense that it carries within it the very signs of the possible, the inactual, and therefore the virtual. So I'm thinking here, for instance, there is this French novelist, Leonora Miano. She has a book named, I don't know how to say that, Rouge Impératrice, Red Imperatrice, I don't know how to say that. But she takes an Afrofuturist perspective on the technological inversion of the future between Africa and Europe, with Europeans becoming the climate refugees of tomorrow's Africa. In this sense, the experience of the future here is experimentation, a way of orienting oneself in today's world as if it were a foreign world. So the language of the future could thus be said to be a foreign language, or what's more, an untranslatable foreign language, in the sense that, as Barbara Cassin puts it, an untranslatable is not that which cannot be translated into a language, such as the idiosyncratic, unsuppressible resistance of a people's culture genius. But it is, on the contrary, an untranslatable in the sense that it is precisely that which we never stop translating, and which is thus deritualized and deteriorized and denationalized. So untranslatable is what we try to approach through different versions, precisely because there is no literal core that characterizes once and for all the meaning of what we want to say. So thinking about the future and learning the future as a foreign language is precisely about taking care of the future as that which escapes knowledge, definitive knowledge. So preserving the future means that it doesn't have to be what we know, it has to be able to outwit predictions, precisely in order to survive as the future. And to do this, we need to invent a language, concepts, and metaphors that bridge the gap between, on the one hand, a world already here, on the brink of the abyss, and under the signs of sensory experience, and on the other hand, a field that, fortunately, never experiences such an immediate grasp of data. So how do we invent the language of the future? How do we bring it out of the spectrality that constantly threatens it when the social and political conditions of existence are constantly on the brink of destruction? So positing the irreplaceability of the Earth in ecological slogans, saying that there is only one Earth, that there is no planet B, for example, means steering it away from the circuit of economic and racial fungibility. To say that there is only one Earth for everyone, that the Earth is not part of futuristic technological solutionism plans, but also that the Earth is part of biogeological time, and therefore that its livability as a world, and therefore as a condition of possibility for the future, is threatened with extinction by our inaction by capitalist extractivism. And similarly, at the geopolitical level, we need to wrest peace from its empiricity, that is, from the military logic of pacification, which dangerously identifies border security with peace. So we need also to give peace back its futuricity, its capacity to generate new forms of life. And I had another page, but I forgot it somewhere. So, I don't know, in my bag or... But I mean, just to conclude, and this doesn't matter. It's just that it seems weird or paradoxical to advocate for the ideality, to maintain the ideality of the future in a materialist way, if we can say that. But I think it's important because we have all these discourses on the idea that the future has to be like the development of what it is, and with all the technological basis of that register of representation of the future. So yes, virtualizing the future means that we also have to engage critically in this ideality of the future. That would be my end.
Thank you. I love this kind of performative coup de grace where you don't have a future or an end. Yeah. Leave it open-ended for the and so therefore, are there any questions to keep this future going here? I'll finish the metaphor there. Sorry. Any questions?
I just thought the question of the child is quite interesting. Well, I'm not sure if I understood everything you said, but that's almost like a symbolic question that structures a lot about the present, the past, and the future. And that's almost like a situation on which this kind of questioning seems to be dependent, on which we can kind of maybe ground this temporal oppression. And I think there's something about that position, as well as this question that's present in the child, like the question of instinct, for example. I think there's something about this, you realize something about the question on how to get out of that temporal oppression or stay inside of it. You also mentioned something about not having, about this question of not yet having a speech, this transition in terms of having a speech or not having a speech. I don't know if there's something more I can say about this, because I don't know, like this question of ritualization, you're saying that's, I think, to me, like this holographic, our kind of holographic construction of reality. I don't know if that's what you...
Holographic?
Yes, so this kind of, this aspect in the sense that reality is, it's like it's a construction, it's not just, it's a psychological, it's a construction, it's, a symbolic construction, it's a psychological construction, it's not just, I don't know if what I'm saying is kind of relevant to you. I just think you touched on something that's quite important.
It's such a, first of all, maybe it's not just a symbolic or metaphorical, maybe. When I take the question of the issue, the question of childhood as a really important political issue for society when you think about future, it's not just metaphorical, like for instance in Arendt, political development of the idea that the real birth is a political birth, and so on. It's completely neglected the reality of what it is to have child, to be a child, the work, the labor of children raising, and so on. So this is not in that sense. But of course there is a symbolical, as you say, aspect of it. So that's why I also talked about the idea of rechilding the future in kind of way. You say to when we think our theories is mostly deprived of children. It's always as if we were talking from immediately the point of a completely adult person, the conscious of the adult, of this kind of imaginary of the fully accomplished actors in the sense of psychological and developmental anthropology. So here, what I find interesting is that when you think violence, state violence, from the point of view of the children, this directly means that you are interrogating not only, of course, as I said, the violence inflicted to the living bodies, which is brutal, of course, but also how you inflict a violence directly to the lived life, the lived experience, the lived body, and so on. So the capacity of the body to generate, to create world making, and so on. And this, of course, has dramatic consequences, of course, for the possibility to experiment a future for
also action. I think our relationship with action.
Yes, of course. So that's interesting because yes, of course. Not only Nadera shows that. There are also, of course, all those empirical studies also know that, for instance, the idea of muting is related also to a kind of impossibility to engage in transformative action, for instance. And there is, of course, all those literature around trauma and so on. But not only that, the idea that when you affect the capacity of language, of not only representation, of language of something really arbitrary, something that is not only, as I said, just referential to what is going on, capacity, to disrupt the reality of the referential, aspect of the language, then you really impute the possibility of living a dignified life.
That's kind of, sorry to interrupt you, kind of the psychological violence aspect in writing and talking.
Yeah, but the psychological violence is attributed to a structural violence, justice, a relationship, a brutalization of the mode of existence in we could say in global south, because it's not only, of course, in states of war. So how do we do with that? I mean, how do we critically think about this kind of maybe computation? And look, of course, if we have to situate also our epistemology, from what are in our collectives the most urgent question of our situation, and this I think is yes, the exposure of children to. I mean, I don't know if social death is the right concept, but to premature death, or mainly it's a gender also exposure. I think yes, we have to make a place for that. Now, I mean yes, our decolonial feminism.
We have two questions, one from Laquan and then.
Future, the children. I wonder whether you have heard about a movement in China in the States. Is that some of the younger people claim that they are the last generation, in the sense that they refuse to have children. And this is the most powerful statement, dissident kind of position against the state, saying that we are the last generation. What are you going to do with yourself? We are going to die with you. Basically, it's the anti-biopolitics is the most powerful way of fighting against the biopower of the state. So I think what you mentioned is, in a way, I'm very excited that finally we came to talk about the younger generation, because I think a lot of discussions we have had was primarily, it's really the existing paradigm of the adult world, while I see the younger generations, probably in East Asia, for example, are living in a slightly different kind of world, and the resistance, the anger, and the way they resist is very different from the vocabularies that we have inherited from Marxist, that traditional Marxist framework related to labor and so on and so forth, and commodity and so on. So in a way, I'm very excited that we finally have a room to open up to understand the real younger generation. What are we going to do with them? With the awareness that they are themselves doing something already in their own interesting ways that is in a way defy our existing critical category. So I just wonder what you think about the future with, how we would articulate new systems of thinking to face a future that is dying, that is proclaimed by the younger generations that we will die with it.
I'm really interested in the way mobilized people and children use auto-nominate themselves, auto-call themselves, and for instance, in what you say now, the idea of the last generation, it's very interesting because I said it participates to this revivifying of critical, theological, political vocabulary, because it's critical in the sense that, okay, so now there is no future in a kind of way anymore. There's no duration. So how do we do to interrupt this idea of that are not gonna be kind of a continuity and so on, and to say that okay, we refuse, for instance, to have children. It's really interesting also because it is part of reproductive justice. It is this articulation of reproductive justice with environmental justice, of course, because it's not only reproductive justice, not only, of course, to have the right to have children, but also not to have them. And there it is a critique also of how childhood has become also a commodified imaginary of the bourgeois family and so on. So if you want to, a really good life is to have kids, after 2 kids, and so on, and a pet, and that's it. And there, this generation tells us that no, that's not a dream. That's not even a dream. That's not, we refuse this kind of a thing. And it's also unlivable in our planet now. So we can't live we can't live like that. So I think that there is also a critique not only of bourgeois family as but also of model of unsustainability of this model, planetary speaking, politically speaking, and so on. So I find it really very interesting. And also I think that I think that it is more interesting, I think, not to compare and exclude those kind of mobilization. For instance, the mobilization for the lives of our kids, our children in the suburbs and so on, France and so on, in Palestine, etc. And the kids who are politically mobilized with the Friday marches and so on for us, because I think we can articulate both of them and see really that there is a statement also, a positive statement of what is also childhood. Not only a negative statement that we are not political capital and so on, but we are also a force of proposal, a force of imaginary. We have our own language and so on. And yes, here can we say that in the Marxist framework that children are a class? As there was this materialist feminism who say that women are class, and we have to think like that. I'm not sure. I'm not going in that. I think that there is something interesting in the way that we must hold with the idea of the oppressed, which is Because the oppressed doesn't mean that it's necessarily a class oppression. I mean, it can be someone who is underclass. So the idea of the oppressed, I think, is interesting. And childhood is oppressed by children are oppressed. Sorry, the children. Children are oppressed in this temporality of capitalist acceleration, destruction of nature. Because when we are accelerating time, we are destroying constantly nature resources.
I like the presentation a lot, and it's also where you ask the question of who is the premise of our theorizing, who are the inhabitants of our theory, and then you bring up the question of childhood as opposed to the adult, right, who is implicitly the subject for whom we theorize and with which we theorize. But I was thinking that it's also, there are other kinds of things that get elided in this because it's the able-bodied adult, so we don't think about disability. We think about the human and not the animal, and so on and so forth. So I think there are multiple openings from the argument that you're making as to who inhabits the theory that we speak about when we think about the future. But to go along with the other question that was asked here, there's this classic book from almost 30 years ago, Nancy Shepherd Hughes' book, Death Without Weeping, which looks at migrant female laborers in Brazil. And so they live in precarious conditions. When they have children, they have to decide which child they're going to let go of. Right? So it is to decide which child will be able to live a full future and which child will not. So if it is a weak, sickly infant, they decide to let go of it. Right? And so there again, it's not about a commitment to life that is important. Do you see what I mean here? The commitment to the life of the child in order to create a future, but is to let go of the child so that you're thinking with the question of this child has no future if it lives. Right? So there are multiple questions of that kind which also require thinking with.
Yeah, and I was thinking also there is this work of, she's a French-Moroccan anthropologist, and she worked a lot of the, the female Moroccan migrant workers in the south of Spain, in, this, not haciendas, but how to say, on the Costa del Sol. Well, in the south, in the, where there are all those big fields of strawberries, and it's interesting because the socialist government in the early 2000s framed a model of contract which stipulates precisely that migrant women should have children to pretend to claim for to go to work to Spain. So the idea that you let your children is a clause, it's a clause, how do you say that? It's a clause of the contract. Mm-hmm. So of the contract of the labor force and so on. And you have all this. So to produce the productivity of capital also remain on this idea that some woman in the international division of labor has to be mothers first. So it's a weaponizing of motherhood in the extraction of surplus value, and there has to be like this clause was there to guarantee the return. So because if you have children, means that of course you're gonna return and feed them and so on. So yes, if you think of Marxist point of view of the labor of women, we cannot disregard all this aspect of motherhood and the weaponization of motherhood and children.
Okay, unless you have any more small questions.
Comments, really.
Go ahead. Yes.
Thank you for this. It's really a very, very interesting entry point into everything that's being discussed here. I mean, just kind of a comment is in the sense that, you know, the childhood was invented. It's a modern, right? The whole it's a modern invention. I mean, think about think about all the chimney sweepers, the kind of the early depictions of Gin London. You know, you had the animals, the drunken laborers, and the children. You know, whatever in a corner right next to the. It's just, and then it's crazy because then you had this kind of invention of childhood, and then I think in the West you see this kind of I can't remember. There's a few books on this already.
Philippe Farier's book, Centuries of Childhood.
Yeah, and then there's the end of childhood. I mean, which I think in the Western or kind of advanced capitalist world is more kind of has to do with a extreme sexualization of childhood. Like there's a sexualization of culture. Like there's something that gets skipped over immediately. You know, as soon as their childhood is kind of over in that sense. There's a kind of an interesting dynamic that's happening there with this kind of hypersexualization of culture. And then in the non-advanced capitalist world, you know, children are completely dispensable, but they're necessary because when you think about it, all these, you know, it's the working class or the kind of lower classes, it's always the, you know, they have more children. And the question is why, right? It's almost like, you know, and then the bourgeois claim is that they're ignorant, they don't know, they can't use reproduction. No, but actually, having more children makes you more visible, gives you more labor force. It's necessary for survival. And then it's crazy that these are the children who are dispensable again and eliminated and have no, I mean, it's just such a, I just thought the image is really, it's kind of, in both advanced capital, where you have this kind of also retreat and beginning disappearance of childhood, and then in, I don't know where, on non-advanced, you know, whatever, kind of outside the kind of the center, these children are expendable labor. They're just like the chimney sweepers. There's kind of a weird, I don't know. It's like.
No, I agree with. I mean, I think that so there is a possible sentimentalization of the idea of childhood because childhood is not available to everybody. I mean, childhood was available to you and me and all of us. And I think that is something to think with as well. And so the idea that to think about the future with the child is already possibly a bourgeois position, and to put it very crudely. Because if you think about the vast numbers of humans for whom childhood was never a possibility, right? And I was just remembering, the lines from Seamus Heaney, during the troubles in Northern Ireland, very similar to what's happening in Palestine, where he says, "I shouldered a kind of manhood bearing the coffins of dead relatives." Right. So I think we need to think about childhood in a slightly more complicated way, or using the idea of the child to think with the future, because it's not available to everyone. The idea of childhood.
No, but that's exactly the point. Yeah. It's a kind of a capital that is distributed, differentiated way according to the social group, of course, that pertain to that. For instance, it's really interestingly, again, very concretely speaking, for instance, how all the, in the migration, the category of isolated minor. You have that, no?
Sorry,
isolated minors. How do you say that in the migrants?
Unaccompanied.
Exactly. That's unaccompanied minors. Yes, and all this the struggle according to how can we define a minor, including biopolitically speaking, with the growth of of course, of the bones and the form of the mandibulans and so on. So this is we have a racial biopolitization of a minority here, really literally speaking. So here we see that to give the status, like the legal status of minor, it's also something disputed, and to have that it is politically disputed, and because of course of all the repressive politics of migration. So some are exactly, are children and are allowed to be children also because others are deprived of their childhood. So this is the idea of the counterpart, the representation. And there is a lot of level of that, of course. There is the unaccompanied migrant, but also, inside the citizenship status, you have different, of course, level of authorized childhood and recognized dignified childhood, and so on. So, no, yes, just to say that it's yes, there is not something like a stable legal category, and we have to think it in the social life of this, also of this category, and the reality of the social relationship. Yes, we are in.
Okay, just one more. Oh, sorry.
Well, I mean, we're about to have an open discussion, which was
the global discussion.
Yeah, with a kind of round table. So perhaps we could just call it there and save those questions for that. Just have a kind of quick break and differentiation between them. 5 minutes. Yeah. And say thank you very much.
Thank you.